Okay, the recording has been started. Hey everyone, welcome to another Open Cluster Management Community Meetings. Today is September 27, 2024, and on the agenda today, I'm going to talk a bit about the work that we have been doing on the SIG multi-cluster space, specifically the cluster inventory, cluster profile API. And then later, Quinn Hao and Qizhen will talk about how we are planning to adopt this API and populate it, and and why we're doing why are we spending effort on this project. So if we head over the SIG multi-cluster, we under the technical leadership of Qizhen and contribution from many others, we have been working on the cluster profile API. Think of this API as sort of we want to have a standardization of a cluster inventory API, because across different multi-cluster providers, there are different APIs that represent a cluster unit. For example, in OCM IO, we have a managed cluster. So that makes it hard for the consumers, third-party consumers and third-party users to adopt those multi-cluster provider APIs, because they will have to, some days they have to import OCMIO, another day they have to use, for example, the fleets from Azure, and then ClusterNet, and then Kamada, etc. So we decide to uh, come to an agreement with the community to try to come up with a common cluster inventory API. So it's been making pretty good progress. We have the page here that's sort of described under the Signal cluster website, sort of describe what the cluster profile is. So the difference between this cluster profile API and specifically against our OCMIO managed cluster is this cluster profile API under the consensus of others contributors and people that technical leadership on the Kubernetes space as well. We decided to make this namespace scope. So that's one of the key difference. So the namespace scope is, I think, if I remember correctly, it's mostly due to being able to use RBAC. So having the RBAC really helps us to lock down the inventory, and provides additional permission capability that's probably not that easy to do with cluster scope API. So it talks generally about some terminologies. For example, cluster inventory, it's mostly a conceptual term. And then the cluster manager in here, the cluster manager represents the multi-cluster managers such as OCMIO, Azure Fleet, etc. And we expect the cluster manager to be able to create, update, and delete on the cluster profile CRD or API, and then each cluster profile represent a single workload cluster. And then when there's a third-party consumer, which I think a few weeks ago, we did a summary on KubeCon China, and we had some prototype using Cube as one of the consumer to do some workload balancing, scheduling, and that's could be one of the API consumer, as well as maybe something like Argo would be able to consume cluster profile as well. So as I said, we've been working on we have our own cluster inventory API inventory under the SIG. There have been contribution from many of us. I think Quinn Hao, off the top of my head, myself, and Q Chang. And then, if you want more information, you can always refer back to the CAP for all the technical details on the API. And the current status for the API is, so there are a few generic fields that we already defined, such as the version, the properties, and the conditions, but they're quite basic. And one of the things that the community have in the SIG multi-cluster community have asked for is actually adding the credential access. So this sort of allows the third-party consumer to actually directly access the clusters and be able to maybe apply the workload, or view some of the status in the cluster, etc. directly. So there there's a cap that is created for adding the credential definitions. There's lots of comments. If you're interested, there's tons of good discussion and feedback here, and we're hoping to resolve some of this discussion and get this merged in. And then once it's merged, we can go back over on the cluster inventory API side. We can implement the API changes necessary to be able to have the credential definition. So, okay, all that said, once again, why are we doing this? Because again, we want to adopt a standardized cluster inventory API, so that maybe the other popular projects such as Argo will consume it, and then they will be able to use the integration between Argo and OCM IO a little bit better. So before I pass it to Quinn Hao to talk about our plan on how to actually populate the cluster profile API, are there any questions?
If I could just ask one clarification quickly. So the cluster profile, we plan to create a role or cluster role for this to give it namespace scope. So cluster role, apologies. If we end up including the credentials field, is that then just giving namespace access to kind of a variety of credentials, potentially?
Yes, and that is sort of by design as well, and hence why we want it to be encapsulated in the namespace, because that particular namespace. So we'll have those credential access, and then that's how, for example, in Argo CD, the controller sits in a particular namespace, and that's without the cluster profile, without the credential access for now. The Argo CD controller sits in one particular namespace. I think the Argo CD namespace, and whenever they sort of create not create a cluster. Let's say they add a connection to a cluster. They put their secrets in that particular namespace as well, and that controller only has access to those secrets or those credential access within that namespace. So I think I know what you're trying to get at, but I think that is how we design it, and that's why we wanted the namespace scope in the first place. Qjang, do you want to chime in here regarding the Patrick's question?
Yeah. So it's not being decided yet. The idea is we will have multiple controller that will have different permissions for the credential, and those credentials will be put in a different namespace. So, for example, if you have Argo and Q as different consumer for those API, they will have different permissions for the cluster. So they will need the different credentials. So the idea is that they will be those credentials for different cluster will be put in a different namespace, like for and all the credential in a different cluster will be put in one namespace. And for Argo CD, the credential for all the cluster will be put in another namespace. So when Argo CD access the credential, it will just need the permission of getting secret for a certain namespace in this control plane. So that's the idea currently.
Got it. Thank you. Just wanted to be clear, this is the intention, to add credentials at namespace scope. Thank you.
Yes. And if any, so it's still under discussion. Like we are also discussing whether we need to specify context of the kubeconfig in that. So there could be one secret be shared, have multiple contexts and be shared by multiple controllers, but there's also security concerns. So any comments or questions relating to this, welcome to put any comments in this enhancement proposal here.
Thank you, Kujan. Thank you, Patrick, for asking such a good question. Any other questions before I pass it over to Quinn Hao to talk a bit about how OCM is going to consume this API and populate the cluster profiles? Okay, I'll stop sharing and let Quinn Hao present her work in progress. Then.
Let me share my screen. Sorry, where is the screen sharing button?
So at the bottom.
Oh, I see it. Could you see my screen? Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Thanks, Mike. I will talk about this peer. This peer is actually we have this GitHub issue, and this we have at least some items we should do. And this peer is about the first item to sync the mandate cluster and the cluster profile API, which ensures the backward compatibilities. Also, this peer we mainly did two things. First is we add a feature gate that we can enable the cluster profile API, and also we add a new controller to sync the info between the mandate cluster and the cluster profile API. I can use this to show you more details. For the installation part, we add a new feature gate called the cluster profile in the registration agent part, so that you need to enable it to use this feature. It's by default is disabled. And also in the registration part, we add a new controller called the cluster profile controller. This controller is mainly to sync the info between mandate cluster and the cluster profile. It did some quite clear, simple thing. First is try to sync some required labels, like the cluster set label and the cluster profiles managers them to the cluster profile API. And also it try to sync a field to the properties from the many clusters class claim in the status, it will be synced to the profiles properties field. And also it will also try to sync some conditions from managed cluster to the cluster profile. the status, and then all the things will be synced, be patched. And another thing need to mention, and since the cluster profile is a cluster scoped resource, so all the new added cluster profile API will be installed in the Open Cluster Management namespace. And since the cluster profile require a manager name, so the currently we add the manager name also as Open Cluster Management. I think that's all for the current situation. And Qiujin also have some comments on the installation parts. I will try to fix them later and get it finally reviewed. Yeah, I think that's all for this PR. I'm not sure, Mike and Qiujin, do you have any comments for this?
And this is based on the prototype that you did for the KubeCon China presentation, right? Where you had the integration between OCM, cluster profile, and Cube. Is that
Yeah, it's part of the demo in the KubeCon China. This part is to sync the info to the cluster profile API. Yes.
great? I
It
just
does
want
not
to
include. Sorry.
go ahead.
No, it doesn't. It does not include the credential part. It does not include the credential part yet. So, I think, later when we probably will not update the credential part in OCM, but in some because that could be provided by managed server account and cluster proxy, that they could provide the credential and endpoint to access API server, access managed cluster API server. So we probably will. I haven't thought thoroughly about that, but probably will be handled in one of the add-on that updates the cluster profile status to add the profile, add the credentials. That probably is something we could do at the next step.
Yeah, in the KubeCon China, we also did the credential part by the managed service accounts and the cluster permission.
I see. That's pretty amazing. Thank you, Cornell, for sharing.
Okay, thank you. I will stop share.
Thank you again, Cornell. I think that's all the topics that we have today. Again, if anyone's interested in the cluster profile work, the SIG work, or the Greenhouse PR, please provide your feedback or comments, or if you want to contribute, please feel free as well. Any other additional questions? If not, thank you everyone for joining. See you next time. Take care. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.